Hello from the Center for Livable Cities in Singapore, and a warm welcome to the 15th episode in our CLC webinar series, Cities Adapting to a Disrupted World. I'm your host, Dinesh Naidu. Today's webinar is titled Social Resilience in a Disrupted World. But first, some housekeeping. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this webinar. To access this, just click on the Interpretation tab on your Zoom toolbar and select Chinese. We have two speakers for our webinar today. Our first speaker, Professor Daniel Aldrich, will share how social infrastructure can help build resilient communities. Dawn Yip, Coordinating Director at the Partnerships Project Office at Singapore's Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, will then speak on how Singapore's emerging stronger conversations have helped strengthen ties amongst Singaporeans. Michael Koh, Executive Fellow at the Center for Livable Cities, will moderate the dialogue and audience Q&A. Now, we've received questions for the speakers during registration, but you can still pose questions to them using the Q&A tab. If you need any help, please use the raise hand function. I'm now honored to welcome and introduce our first speaker, Professor Daniel Aldrich. Professor Aldrich is a full professor of political science, public policy and urban affairs, and Director of the Security and Resilience Studies Program at Northeastern University. Some of his research topics include post-disaster recovery, countering violent extremism, and the interaction between civil society and the state. He is an award-winning author of 5 books and has published more than 60 peer-reviewed articles. He also contributes to news outlets such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, and NPR. Professor Aldrich was also a CLC Visiting Fellow in January 2020. Without further ado, Professor Daniel Aldrich, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Dinesh, and good morning, everybody. For me, good morning, good evening for you. It's an honor to be back with CLC. I'll begin by putting out my email address and Twitter handle in case members of the audience might have questions we don't have time for today. I'm very excited to be a part of this process and would love to continue the conversation. So my lab has long looked at this question of shocks and disasters, and we've been very fortunate to look at them across time and space. And here are some images from some of the areas that we've worked in, including Hurricane Katrina into New Orleans, where I used to live, the 1923 Tokyo earthquake, the 1995 Kobe earthquake, and the 2011 triple disasters. We've had this chance around the world to try to understand what factors are most critical for individuals, households, neighborhoods, and cities facing some kind of major catastrophe. And while there are many people out there who have tried to emphasize issues like individual preparedness or how much money you're receiving, I think, in fact, the most critical driver for resilience and recovery comes from our networks, the people that we know. And there are really 3 different types of connections that we have: bonding, bridging, and linking social ties. Bonding social ties connect people who are quite similar, people who sound like us, speak the same language, maybe have the same background. In contrast, bridging ties connect us to people who are different. That might be through a workplace or a school, an affinity group, or a club. And where bonding and bridging ties are horizontal connections, linking social ties are vertical ones, connecting me as a normal resident to someone in power and authority. These 3 types of connections are the critical elements in successful recoveries and being able to survive and thrive during a shock. And here's some reasons why they matter. First of all, after a major shock, everything from a heart attack to a fire to a flood, people who have survived that event have to think through, do they want to go back to this site, to the home or business where it happened? Or do they want to move someplace else? We call this the exit or voice choice. As a survivor of Hurricane Katrina, for example, I had to decide, do I want to stay in a city that regularly floods and is literally underwater compared to the sea nearby? So too, after a major fire or a flood or a tsunami around the world, survivors have to balance going back and investing in their community, rebuilding it as a group using their voice, or leaving the area and going someplace else. We have found around the world, people with stronger bonding and bridging ties, they tend to stay and invest in their communities. They use voice. Individuals with weaker ties, people who don't have the sense of place and connection, those individuals tend to use exit. Another element that these social ties provide is collective action, the ability of many people working together to achieve something not possible with only one or two people working. And disasters and crisis, such as COVID-19, are such examples of collective action challenges. If we all don't wear our masks, if we all don't physically distance, it's much more challenging for our society to get through a pandemic. In societies where there is trust, interaction, strong senses of connection, in those societies, collective action is more possible. Where they're more fragmented, where they don't believe in each other, they have less reciprocity or trust, in those societies, unfortunately, it's much more challenging to get things done. Finally, we know that strong social ties help us have mutual aid or informal insurance. During a shock, these kind of ties provide assistance that the regular providers cannot. Maybe, for example, there aren't stores open nearby. You have to borrow food or water from a neighbor. Maybe childcare provider services aren't working right now, and your child has to go someplace nearby to a friend's or neighbor's house for a while. Those are the kind of broader ideas that we've seen in our lab. I want to give some very specific examples now. I'll begin with how even before a shock arrives, in this case a hurricane, we see these social ties make a difference. Our research tracked how different types of connections affect behaviors even before that large-scale risk arrives in our backyards. And it turns out having broader and more diverse connections helps us listen to authorities and move ourselves out of dangerous areas, like in this case, Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas. Individuals with a broader set of connections, different types of information, a broader set of people that they could talk to, those individuals listened to warnings from the authorities, and they left areas that were soon going to be hit by a shock. Unfortunately, individuals with fewer ties, a smaller sense of connection, and not as many broad, diverse connections, those individuals did not leave. So even before the shock arrives, these ties are critical. We also see from a number of different disasters that having these trust and strong ties make a difference in saving lives. For example, during Japan's triple disasters of exactly a decade ago, when we had a 20-meter tsunami, those communities along the coast that had stronger ties, people working together, they were able to get more people out, save more lives than communities nearby that had fewer of those ties. And even during COVID-19, we see that communities with stronger bonding, bridging, and linking social ties, they have fewer COVID-19 cases because people are listening to authorities and working collectively, and because better healthcare is keeping them stronger. After the shock moves, during the recovery phase, these same kind of ties draw people back. And here I've given several different examples. In 1923, 1925, and 2011, after all of these shocks, communities where there were stronger ties between people, those were the areas that recovered population helped draw people back. And even during the hard to imagine radioactive contamination of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, these social ties provided strong mental support. Individuals with stronger social ties, they had fewer concerns with PTSD and anxiety. The very good news for us is that these social ties are not set in stone. We can build them deliberately. I've given a few examples here. Things like community currency and time banking. Getting to know our neighbors. I think we asked you before the presentations began how many neighbors that you know. Urban design around third spaces, parks and green areas, block parties and social events, and engagement in civil democracy. And we even know, for example, here in Singapore, there are great examples where communities have worked collectively on issues like climate change and heat areas. And this is one example that I was able to be part of when I came to Singapore. It feels like forever ago, where communities working with authorities think through the hazards that they face, and the plans and policies put in place are not just top down, but rather bottom up, emerging from local needs and concerns and being built through community cooperation and collaboration. Just to wrap up then, oftentimes we think about disasters and shocks in terms of an individual level preparation. Do I have a kit? Am I prepared? And certainly those things are important. But I think more critically for us, especially in an era of climate change climate disasters, we need to be thinking about our social infrastructure. Are we connected to each other? Do we have horizontal and vertical ties from our community to other members of the community, but also to decision makers above us in power and authority? Thank you so much for the chance to talk today. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Aldrich, for that great presentation, which was very relatable in the context of the pandemic that we all find ourselves in. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, Dawn Yip. Dawn is Coordinating Director of Partnerships Project Office at the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, which spearheads the Singapore Together movement in partnership with public agencies and fellow Singaporeans. She worked in various agencies such as the Ministry of National Development, Ministry of Health, and Ministry of Trade and Industry before she left the public service, and was an independent consultant in foresight, public engagement, and organization development. She was also visiting faculty with the Singapore Management University. Without further ado, Ms. Dawn Yip, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Dinesh, for that very kind introduction, and hello, everyone. It's a privilege for me to be here to speak with you. And thank you, Daniel, too, for that fascinating presentation on the link between social ties and crisis response outcomes. I guess you could think of my presentation as one example that explores the application of what Daniel has shared in the Singapore context. So let me just start with a few brief words about Singapore Together. So Singapore Together is a movement that was launched by Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Heng Swee Keat. And it's about Singaporeans working with one another and with the government to build our future Singapore. Now, governments typically work for citizens, delivering services and public goods. And Singapore Together is intended as a shift towards also working with citizens, so that citizens are not just consumers of public services, but also partners in the building of Singapore. So what is the impetus for this movement? There are a few reasons. One key reason is complex challenges. Complexity means that issues can only be effectively addressed when the multiple stakeholders that are involved in the ecosystem come together, and not just government or private sector or business or community alone trying to solve the problem. A second reason, of course, is that Singapore has become a more mature and a more diverse society, and Singaporeans increasingly want to have a say and to be involved. And there are also a wider range of views that we need to navigate, and that can only be done when you bring people into contact with each other in conversation and in action. And this form of partnership then also grows a society of owners, not just consumers, and that is the great aspiration for us. And finally, our hope is that partnering between government and citizens grows mutual trust and care, or to use the language from Daniel's presentation, social capital, which we see has a wide range of benefits. So COVID struck us in early part of 2020, and our Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong called it the crisis of a generation, and indeed it was. And in the immediate aftermath, there was a massive crisis response. The Singapore government rolled out many public health measures and financial and social support, and community groups and families and individuals also stepped forward to help in every way that they could. I remember people donating the grants that they got. They helped to distribute hand sanitizers. And in the early days when masks were in short supply, people even took to sewing masks. And all this, to my mind, is evidence of a social connection among Singaporeans. It was natural, it came up organically, and I think it speaks well of the social resilience that is already there. But beyond this immediate response, both from the government and from different stakeholders, we were also beginning to notice that there were pockets of reflection and soul searching going on. There were people thinking and talking about what lay beyond. There was a sense that this crisis was showing us who we are as a people, both our strengths, that social connection and generosity that I spoke of a bit earlier, but also the weaknesses in our society. The cracks showed up more strongly. It's been said, we share this storm, but all of us are experiencing the storm in different ways. And so there was a sense that there would be great value to look beyond the immediate crisis and to engage Singaporeans in a broader conversation of what it would mean to recover and to emerge a better Singapore. And so this is where the Emerging Stronger conversations came in. Our Deputy Prime Minister described this as an exercise for us to hear from each other the impact of COVID on all of us, and also to hear from the ground what ideas people had to take Singapore forward. And importantly, our aspiration for this conversation was that it would also lead to action. Let me share some quick features of the conversation, and I just summarize it as 3 Ds: diverse, digital, and deep. So the first point about the diversity of the conversation, we would bring people together about 50 at a time, and we aimed for as diverse a group as we could possibly manage. It was open, anybody could sign up, and we would try to compose groups as diversely as possible. It was about inclusiveness, but it was also to enable people to hear from and build bridges with people unlike themselves. And then the second point, digital. So this is wholly unique. These conversations were almost completely digital. Of course, now here we are, this side of the COVID crisis, and all of us becoming very familiar with Zoom and other technologies. But at the time, all of us were still learning how to use Zoom and other digital tools. It was really new for us. And we were actually somewhat concerned about how far we would be able to get people to talk deeply on a digital platform. And as it turned out, the conversations could actually get quite deep. The way we did it was, even though we were in big groups of 50, part of the conversation, a big part of the conversation would be in small breakout groups, often 5, 6 people maximum. And these would be facilitated by a neutral party. And I vividly remember that some conversations found people in tears as we asked them to share what COVID was like for them. There was a young man who talked about not seeing his grandmother for almost 2 months because of the circuit breaker experience. Another person sharing about how their family had lost a job that they had held for many, many years. And all of these really were demonstrative to me of how, even though we were connecting digitally, the conversation could still get to quite a place of intimacy, even among strangers. So when I speak about diversity, it was also diverse in terms of the coverage. We had broad-based conversations, but we had also some thematic conversations covering issues, as you see here, from digitalization and technology to jobs and the economy, to transport, to family violence. All of these were salient to the COVID crisis. And so in terms of just a sort of overview of the numbers, we had about almost 17,000 Singaporeans involved in this, over 88 conversations, 4,000 plus of them in actual facilitated conversations, and another 12,000 through survey instruments. And you can look at these numbers later, but they just give you a sense of the diversity that we managed to achieve through these conversations. And after a sort of reasonable period of conversations, we also put out a report online so that people who weren't part of these conversations could just jump in and have a look at some of the themes that were coming up as well. Here you'll see 15 broad themes that cover a whole range of issues, some of which I've mentioned earlier. Now, I said that the conversations would lead to action, and this is indeed our intention, and this is at the phase that we're at right now. What we're doing is identifying from the themes that have come up through the Emerging Stronger conversations, areas in which we can form alliances for action. These are action-oriented collaborations that involve people from different sectors who can come together and do something together, not just talk and come up with recommendations and ideas, but actually be a part of the action. There's about 19 of them now, some examples there. I'll just give you one more concrete example. And this is the Youth Mental Wellbeing Network. Of course, mental well-being is a major issue, particularly during this season of COVID. And one of the interesting features of this network was we opened it up for anyone to sign up. As long as you had an interest and a passion to do something in this area, you could sign up. And we actually gave this network space to shape the agenda any way they liked. They came up with ideas, decided which ones were most important to work on, and government was there to provide the support to them. So this is a way of working that we hope will go forward, where citizens can really be a part of taking action and shaping Singapore to meet their aspirations. My final slide, I just wanted to close with an extract from this paper, one of the papers that we looked at as we were planning for the conversations. And this one was written by New Zealand's Chief Science Advisor on the subject of the Canterbury earthquakes, Professor Gluckman writes that it's self-efficacy and community efficacy that assist people in recovering. And that really is what I hope that the Emerging Stronger Conversations and the alliances help to do in some way, to give Singaporeans a sense of self and community efficacy as we seek to recover from COVID and the shared crisis that we're going through. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for sharing the great work you're doing with Singapore Together. I was especially interested to learn about how you connect the engagement process with Alliances for Action. Now, before I hand the time over to our moderator, let's reveal the results of the 2 poll questions that we asked you, our audience, before the webinar began. Our first question was, do you know the names of 10 neighbors who live within walking distance of your home? And 66% of 2/3 of us said, no, we don't. But to me, a healthy 1/3 reported that you do know the names of at least 10 neighbors. So that's interesting. And let's have a look at the second question. We asked, which of the following actions have you engaged in the past month alone? And most of us have greeted our neighbors, smaller numbers for the rest. And shout out to the folks who have in the last month checked in on the vulnerable in your neighborhood or organized or volunteered in community activities. So more data coming in from our audience about how we are connected to our neighborhoods. All right, let me now welcome and introduce our moderator today, Mr. Michael Koh. Michael is our center's executive fellow. He has 25 years of experience in the public service, including 7 years as the CEO of the National Heritage Board and 4 years concurrently as CEO of the National Art Gallery. He was also the former Director of Urban Planning and Design at the Urban Redevelopment Authority, where he spearheaded the planning and urban design of the new mixed-use downtown at Marina Bay, revitalization of Orchard Road, and creation of an arts and entertainment district at Bras Basah Bugis. Without further ado, Mr. Michael Koh, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Dinesh. Thank you, Daniel and Dawn, for your presentations. Excuse me. I enjoyed the presentations. Thank you very much. And it just draws to mind all of what's happening in the world and how societies are rising up together as communities to look after the communities, to look after the neighborhoods and contributing ideas to building infrastructure. As we know, when New York City was struck by Hurricane Sandy, most of the downtown New York was knocked out. In fact, the basements flooded, there were no substations, electric substations were not working, lifts were not working, etc. And the process of rebuilding was offered to New York City. You could build a seawall all around the south part of Manhattan as physical infrastructure to protect against future floods. But then they decided to do a community consultation process called Rebuild by Design. And they went out to the communities and asked them, look, we have to build a seawall. What could this mean to your community and what would you rather see? And together, a seawall suddenly became a mound in a park. It was a disguised seawall. Yes, it protected against a projected rising flood, but it was also a park. All right, in some communities, the seawall was accepted on one side facing the waterfront, but on the other side, it became a shop. It became a little area where the neighbors could gather and there could be seating on top. So these were wonderful ideas that came up from the community and kind of changed the impact of having a seawall. But then again, you look at another example in Fukushima. The tsunami knocked out the seawall, but they went back to build a higher seawall. So you have two different ways of looking at infrastructure and the approaches towards engaging society and the community to maybe ameliorate the circumstance and make it something suitable for themselves. Yes, it will protect them, but it's also usable and they take ownership. So with that broad spiel in mind, I'd like to perhaps begin with a question for both Daniel and Dawn. And maybe in reference to some of the work you're doing, how can cities continue to invest in social infrastructure while balancing the need for physical infrastructure? So maybe Daniel, could you start? And maybe you
Sure,
can
yeah.
talk about Boston as well, where you're located in.
Yeah, this is a great question. Of course, every city needs workable infrastructure, physical infrastructure. We need to have roads and ports and dams and bridges. That's a critical element. I think it's very easy for most cities to go directly into physical infrastructure and sometimes to think about social infrastructure after the fact. That is to say, it's much easier for, in our case in Boston, we have a mayor, we have politicians here for a short period of time. They need to show constituents they've done something. And it's easier to point to a seawall, as you mentioned, for example, or a new bridge, than it is to say, what we did? We helped facilitate community conversation. We helped build up a bottom-up project of trust and engagement in citizen science. So I think right now, for many politicians, the initial incentives are to go to the traditional approach of physical infrastructure. And I think part of what our research is trying to do here is to think through, how do we balance out? How do we move some of the money? In Boston, for example, we've been tracking spending on climate extreme measures. How does Boston handle flooding, for example? 92% of the money that's been spent has been on physical infrastructure, only 8% on social infrastructure. So even a little higher numbers, maybe 20% on social and 80% on physical, would give us, I think, a better balance here.
All right, thanks, Daniel, for that response. How about you, Dawn?
So I just want to quickly just say that I resonate with Daniel's point about the invisibility of social infrastructure. You can't point to it and say, that's my big KPI of the year. So that's one of the challenges. So I think responding to the question, I would say that if cities even recognize that social infrastructure is a thing, that's already a big win. Because with that recognition, then comes the will to do something, and then the resources will flow. I think about this wonderful quote that I think is attributed to Winston Churchill, that we shape our buildings, and then afterwards our buildings shape us, right? And it's really true, because our buildings and how infrastructure is laid out dictates where and how much we walk, who we might interact with in a day, how long it takes us to get anywhere, and the list goes on. So I guess my aspiration and maybe my ask of city planners, what if city planners habitually engage the very society for which the infrastructure is being built, and in sharing their aspirations, their needs, and their ideas. And basically the work that I'm doing with a whole team of people across the public service with Singapore Together is exactly trying to do this. We're learning how to do this more and better. We've done it with playgrounds, with parks, with streetscapes. And I'm looking forward to us being able to expand it to a much wider range of infrastructure going forward.
All right, thank you, Dawn. And as Daniel said, it does all come down to communities trusting each other and forming that social connection. And that's why that question was so important. Do you know your neighbors? Because in the Cambridge Road area, which Daniel and both Dawn were involved in, I had a friend who moved in about 5-6 years ago, and he was straight away told by his neighbors, hey, this is, we are prone to flash flooding, and you should move your car to this higher area when this happens, etc. So that's an example of neighborliness and people coming in to tell you and forewarn you and help you. And I think that's just a wonderful example of social connection and communities coming together to trust each other. Now, I guess one issue is it's all well and good for all this to happen, but how do we actually form a set of indicators to point towards success of a community or success of social consultation, etc.? So the question I'd like to pose is, how do cities assess social resilience for proper adaptability measures? Is there any methodology that you know about? And this question comes from Gerald Query Nijmegen from the Netherlands.
This is a great question.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I would say the nice thing about the current state of affairs is there are a lot of scientists out thinking through, how do we capture social infrastructure and resiliency? And I will say my lab has tried this with a new set of instructions, ways of capturing bonding, bridging, and linking social ties. In fact, the question that we asked the audience early on, how many neighbors do you know and what are you doing? That's a great start, actually. We don't need to have complicated, psychologically based questions, asking people about their daily routines, right? Do they feel comfortable walking in their neighborhoods at night? Do they feel comfortable that they have neighbors over to their house regularly? During COVID-19, not so much, but having neighbors over. How many names of people do they know? So we actually put together a very straightforward set of questions that neighbors can use to assess, are they comfortable in their neighborhood? Are they a little uncomfortable in their neighborhoods? One of my mentors said early on, we don't want to see communities where everyone kind of closes the door and goes to their TV, or closes the door and goes to their screen, right? We want them keeping the door maybe a little bit ajar, saying hi to neighbors, feeling comfortable, exchanging food and good and information with them. We also want people comfortable, able to take walks outside. That's a great measure as well. Do people walk in the neighborhood, especially for the elderly and for the young? These are great ways to have those interactions, unplanned interactions with people. So yes, I think there are some good frameworks for capturing, bonding, bridging, and linking, and they really begin with the behaviors of the residents of the community.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And Dawn, do you have any ideas on this?
Well, just a quick add. I mean, I'm no academic, but I think this notion of having some kind of framework and method to rely on is really useful, so that there's a set of evidence and data coming back to you, no matter how proxy it might be. One of the frameworks that we sometimes refer to is by a German foundation, Bertelsmann Stiftung, on social cohesion. And the hypothesis there is that social cohesion derives from three elements. One is connectedness, that people feel a sense of connection to the country and to the institutions in the country. The second is social relations. That means people have relationships of trust with each other. And the third is common good, that people have a sense of mutuality and want to participate in public life, respect the rules, help each other. And then they've got a bunch of indicators under that. And I think they're also using that data set and expanding it into Asia so that we can have some kind of comparison across jurisdictions as well. So these kinds of frameworks can really be helpful guidance. They certainly are for us as we think about new ways to conceive of social resilience.
And I guess these frameworks would be related to the local community and the country and the city that you probably live in, even down to that neighborhood, because there could be different frameworks applied. And in Singapore, in the project that Daniel mentioned at Cambridge Road, we are trying also to establish some social indicators to be being developed with the Singapore ETH Center. And these include trust, sense of belonging, community efficacy, and community engagement. So this is a start for us. It's still a journey ahead, but we hope to work with Daniel and Dawn and other people interested in this topic to establish a set of indicators. Now, we talked about the importance of local governance, empowerment, and ownership that facilitates recovery. I think, Dawn, you provided that very nice quote. And I think, as we mentioned, societies and communities that trust and bond are actually more likely to bounce back. But now, perhaps on to the next question. This is contributed by Madam Fan Siu Ling from Singapore. How can government agencies continue to build up capacity to build social capital in communities? Maybe Dawn, would you like to start this time around?
Yeah, since I'm the person from government, that's a big chunk of the work that we're doing with Singapore Together as well. A few thoughts come to mind. One, of course, one of the most straightforward things to do is to do capability development through training, through just resourcing people to learn more about the different approaches. The second thought that comes to mind is just to start somewhere, to try something. It doesn't have to be very radical or very big piece of infrastructure. Just start on a park or something really small, like a playground, something that where the risk is low, where you can get your feet wet and experiment with these kinds of approaches, and they bring the community together. And the third thought that comes to mind is when we think about building capacity, there's a risk that we think about as this group of experts that will come in and do this social capital stuff. I guess the thought that comes to mind here is that we are all of us social beings, and actually building social capital comes naturally to us. And I think that if we give people in government agencies the space to try something, we'll all take to it and we'll all find new and innovative ways to make it work in the various communities we're a part of.
That's really heartening, and we're all in this current mode at the moment. Dawn, thank you very much for illustrating how we're all trying our very best to adapt to a disrupted world, so to speak. And Daniel, what about your views?
Yeah, I think this is really great to think about. And one of the ways to envision this is perhaps that oftentimes when it goes badly, it's the government talking down to the people. And one of the most successful things, as I said, is when the government is sitting with the people. That is to say, rather than telling people what they want, coming in and being the expert, having that moment just to listen to what communities want. And I think this is part of the idea also that each community, they have a very different vision of their future, a safer future, a less vulnerable future, a more connected future. What works in community X may completely different in community Y. So I think this is part of the idea of, in a sense, being embedded in the communities where you work and recognizing that if we are a leader, if we are someone elected or appointed to do our jobs, we're doing so in a sense to serve with the people, not to talk down to them.
I think that's great, Daniel. And going back to what Dawn said about working with each other and the government working with you, right alongside you. Now, just thinking about the situation we're in and what Dawn was saying about we're all being humans and we like to socialize, etc. And Daniel, I think we talked about communities having block parties or street parties, etc. To have social gatherings, to get to know each other, and through that build social bonds and building up the community resilience. How important is this in regards to, say, physical spaces and social spaces? And I do believe we do have a question related to that, if I'm not wrong. Okay, this is the question, talking about both physical and maybe virtual spaces as well. So how can groups on the fringes of those with less voice be included in the process of social resilience? Oftentimes it's these groups that have the greatest disaster, crisis, vulnerability. However, they could also be the ones that are overlooked, or is it harder to reach them? This is from Kang Lee Wong. So maybe Daniel, could you take the lead first on this one?
Yeah, this is a great point, and often it is the most vulnerable groups. And you can imagine the elderly or the differently abled, who are people who don't necessarily get out and go to a community meeting or attend a rally or a local event. So we have to really think through to make sure that the way we're designing the process is as inclusive as possible. And in a sense, COVID-19 does help a little bit, right? For individuals who can't leave a bed or a wheelchair, it's much easier to access an event through a screen than it might be to travel, let's say, to areas that are in fact harder to get to. I know certainly in Boston, oftentimes the elevators in our train stations are not working very well. And for those individuals who are elderly, very, very challenging for them to get to an event. So I think that's one way to start. How do we make it accessible? But also to, again, maybe go into the communities and spend time there. And I think this is the other thing that we see by spending time there is, who isn't showing up at this meeting, right? Is it only the middle-aged people? Is it only college students? Are there migrants, maybe for whom English is a second language, and they're having a harder time getting involved? So do they need translation, for example? And I know in New Zealand, they've tried for a variety of other languages. Even in Boston, we have, for example, Haitian Creole, we have Spanish, and we have Mandarin, we have other languages that we try to make sure all our materials are distributed in every time, not just once in a while, not just occasionally, so that people can feel part of that process. Because again, you don't want someone thinking, well, I could go, they don't really want me there, right? That'd be a really bad problem. So yes, I agree. Thinking through those individuals on the periphery for whatever reasons and trying to make our very best to make it accessible to them is a critical element.
Right, and over to you, Dawn.
And I was just going to add on to say that even asking that question is already a big win. Sometimes we don't think to ask the question. And so I guess in a way it links to that question about government agencies and building capability. I think what would be great is if government agencies are as diverse as the populations that they serve in. And that way you can make sure you're always sensitized to the various communities because you have that embedded within the public service itself. I'm thinking back to the Emerging Stronger conversations, and one of the groups of people we were quite mindful of is persons with disabilities. And we went the extent of getting SG Enable, which is a group that works with persons with disabilities, to audit our registration form. And they give us really helpful advice to make sure that our registration form was particularly built for persons with disabilities to be able to sign up readily. Yeah, so that was very helpful. I would say we're still very much in the early days of learning how to do this and to even ask the right questions. But we're learning and we're growing in this space.
I'm glad to hear that, it's all a very inclusive process, and we're ever expanding the groups of people that we're involving in the SG Together movement. Now over to that space issue that I was talking about, and how to bring people together both in physical and virtual spaces. We have a question to this effect. Could we have it on screen first? So how can social spaces evolve in this new normal, especially as we are encouraged to go online? How can we effectively build relationships between different groups of people? And I would say, do talk about physical space as well as the virtual world. Maybe Dawn, you could share some of your experiences. We saw the SG Together with all the screenshots of people using either Zoom or Skype.
So I'm happy to go first, because that really was a big question we had for the Emerging Stronger conversations, to make sure that the fact that it was being held digitally didn't get in the way of people perhaps who were less comfortable with technology to participate. So for every conversation, we actually had a few people stand by as tech support, and we would help them sort of diagnose their problems so that they could join. Some people took a whole half hour before they could join in the call. And remember, this was the very early days when we were still learning how to do this. But cutting over actually to physical space as well. I mean, I think it's about being very aware, so that even as we leave things organic and leave things open for people to sign up, we also want to be observant about what we said earlier, the voices that are not there, and to almost go out of our way to make sure that people have the opportunity to engage with communities unlike themselves, so that that bridging capital that Daniel spoke about in his presentation is always in the process of being built and grown over time.
All right, thanks, Dawn. And over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, I think the combination of physical and virtual spaces is going to be a very interesting feature as we try to make sure that we can include people. Certainly, there are ways to do things outside. I know right now, for example, my son's judo class is meeting outdoors regularly when Boston's weather allows it. And that's just the first start, right? Recognizing that even in a pandemic, we can do ways to have group activities, but also thinking about the design of public spaces, their use. Is it that space is set aside primarily for, let's say, paid things like eating outside? Are there spaces for walking? Are there spaces for children to play? Are there mixed use areas? Are there places, blue-green infrastructure that can absorb water during a flood, but also be used as a child's area? So I think there are a lot of things cities can do creatively to make sure that the spaces that we have are open, accessible, and safe. And again, I keep emphasizing safe because especially as people get older, we know from our surveys, people often come to see their neighborhoods as less safe than they were before. That's a dangerous moment. We really want residents to feel they can go outside, take that walk, knock on a neighbor's door, be received positively. Without that kind of feeling, then people begin to sort of close their doors and hunker down.
Right. So I think it's a very, very pertinent issue. How do we plan for social infrastructure and physical infrastructure in the new normal going forward? But it's heartening to know that many people are taking to the virtual world. It's heartening to see that those photos that Dawn showed, and we experimented with it at Cambridge Road, and the seniors were also taking part, and they were just taught by fellow seniors or younger people to come on board. And in the end, it kind of leveled the playing field, and everybody was also able to contribute in this new virtual social space, so to speak. So it's an interesting new world that we face. Thank you for the valuable discussion today. I learned a lot from you, Daniel, and from what's happening in Singapore from you, Dawn. I like the idea of bonding, bridging, and linking capital, social capital, and how it's important for communities to trust each other and form that social connection and develop those social bonds to recover or be more socially resilient, recover from shock or be more socially resilient to future shocks. Thanks also, Dawn. It's very heartening to know that through the SG Together movement, people and government are working with each other, and government is working alongside people with us to formulate new policy and to seek new directions for the future of Singapore. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Dawn. And thank you, audiences, for staying with us. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion and have a great evening. I'll now hand you over to Dinesh.
Thank you, Professor Daniel Aldrich, Ms. Dawn Yip, and Mr. Michael Koh for sharing your time and insights with us today and for guiding us so expertly to consider these issues more deeply. This webinar has been live streamed on CLC's Facebook page, and we'll upload a recording of it tomorrow on our CLC YouTube channel, where you can find over 500 other videos, including several on building social resilience. Thank you too, dear viewers, for your participation. We hope you find these webinars useful, and before you leave, please use the QR code or link to fill in our feedback form. Do tell us what works and how we can do better. We've come to the end of today's webinar, but we will be leaving this room open for another 5 minutes. Feel free to use the chat box to exchange comments with each other and the speaker and moderator, who will also be staying back a little longer to interact with you. Please look out for more of our CLC events in our emailers, website, or social media. The World City Summit 2021, which is starting from the 21st to 23rd of June, is also fast approaching. So follow us online for more information on our speakers and programs. Free registration to attend this largely virtual WCS will open on the 15th of April. Until we see each other again, goodbye and stay healthy.